The room was alive with tension, the kind that crackled in the air and drew stifled groans from classmates who had seen this too many times before. Ethan Ward, sharp-eyed and brimming with righteous indignation, stood at his desk, gesturing animatedly as he made his point. "Your argument falls apart the moment you consider the long-term implications," Ethan declared, his voice steady but laced with barely contained irritation. "You can't just ignore the socioeconomic factors. It's short-sighted and completely irresponsible." Across the room, Sebastian Lee lounged in his seat, exuding an infuriating calmness. With his arms crossed and a faint smirk playing on his lips, he looked as though he were humoring a child's tantrum rather than engaging in an academic debate. "Ward," Sebastian began, his voice a low drawl that carried easily over the murmurs of the room. "If you spent half as much time studying as you do trying to argue with me, you might actually keep up." A collective gasp rippled through the class, followed by a few chuckles. Ethan's cheeks burned as he clenched his fists. "Oh, I'm keeping up just fine, Lee," Ethan snapped, "but if you got off your high horse for 5 seconds, you'd realize the air down here isn't so bad." The professor, who had long since given up trying to mediate their arguments, sighed loudly. "Gentlemen, while I admire your enthusiasm, this is a debate, not a boxing match. Let's move on." As class ended, Ethan gathered his books with a little more force than necessary. The nerve of that guy! Sebastian Lee acted like he owned the world, or at least the small part of it that was Eastwood University. Ethan was too lost in his thoughts to notice Sebastian standing behind him until they collided. Books and papers went flying in every direction, and Ethan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Watch where you're going," Ethan snapped, dropping to his knees to retrieve his scattered belongings. "Maybe if you weren't storming out like a toddler throwing a tantrum," Sebastian shot back, kneeling to help. Their hands brushed briefly as they both reached for the same book, and for a moment they froze. Ethan's breath caught as he looked up, locking eyes with Sebastian. Up close, Sebastian's usual smug expression was absent, replaced by something unreadable. His dark eyes flickered with an intensity that made Ethan's stomach twist in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. The moment stretched, heavy and awkward, until Sebastian cleared his throat and broke the spell. "Here." He handed Ethan the book before standing and brushing off his pants. "Thanks," Ethan mumbled, shoving the book into his bag. Sebastian smirked, the familiar expression snapping Ethan back to reality. "Try not to run anyone over on your way out, Ward." Ethan glared at him, but before he could retort, the professor called out, "Wait a moment, everyone. I have an announcement about the semester project." The classroom, half emptied by students eager to escape, paused mid-motion. Ethan and Sebastian exchanged wary glances before turning their attention to the professor. "This semester," the professor began, "we'll be working on a collaborative project that will count for 40% of your final grade." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Ethan's heart sank. Collaborative usually meant paired. Paired usually meant disaster. "I'll be assigning partners based on your complementary skill sets," the professor continued. "This will ensure that you balance each other's strengths and weaknesses." Ethan's stomach churned. He had a bad feeling about this. The professor began reading off names, and Ethan's anxiety mounted with each pair announced. "And finally," the professor said, looking directly at them, "Ethan Ward and Sebastian Lee." A chorus of gasps and stifled laughs erupted. Ethan froze, his brain unable to process what he'd just heard. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Sebastian, standing a few feet away, let out a low chuckle. "Well, this should be fun." "Fun?" Ethan whipped around to glare at him. "This is a nightmare!" The professor clapped his hands to regain order. "I expect all of you to act professionally and make the most of this opportunity. Dismissed." Ethan turned back to Sebastian, who was already heading for the door, his usual confident stride making Ethan's blood boil. "Don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you, Lee," Ethan called after him. Sebastian paused in the doorway, looking over his shoulder with that infuriating smirk. "I wouldn't dream of it, Ward." As the door closed behind him, Ethan slumped into his seat, groaning. Of all the people in the world, why him? The library at Eastwood University was supposed to be a sanctuary of quiet and focus. For Ethan Ward, however, it had become a battleground. He sat across from Sebastian Lee at a small wooden table tucked into a corner, his laptop open and a scowl plastered across his face. "This doesn't make sense," Ethan said, jabbing a finger at the outline on Sebastian's tablet. "You can't just skip over the introduction. It sets the tone for the entire presentation." Sebastian didn't even look up, calmly scrolling through his notes. "The introduction is fluff. We need to get straight to the analysis if we want to hold their attention." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Fluff? It's called context, Lee. Not everyone enjoys being thrown into the deep end of your overcomplicated theories." "And not everyone needs their hand held through basic concepts," Sebastian replied, his voice cool and even. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in frustration. "This is impossible. Do you ever compromise, or is it your way or the highway?" Sebastian finally met Ethan's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Compromise isn't efficient?" Ethan groaned, running a hand through his hair. "How are we supposed to work together if you won't even consider my input?" Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "I am considering it. I'm just rejecting it." The hours dragged on, filled with more arguments than progress. By the time the library's overhead lights dimmed, a warning that closing time was near, Ethan was visibly exhausted. He leaned his head on his hand, eyes drooping, as he tried to reread a section of their assigned topic. Sebastian glanced up from his notes, his sharp gaze softening ever so slightly as he took in Ethan's slumped posture. Dark circles framed Ethan's eyes, and his movements had slowed to a sluggish pace. For a moment, Sebastian hesitated. Then, with a barely audible sigh, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over Ethan's shoulders. Ethan stirred, blinking groggily. "Huh?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He tugged at the unfamiliar fabric. "Is this yours?" Sebastian looked away, feigning indifference. "It was either that or let you drool on your notes. Consider it an act of mercy." Ethan's lips twitched into a sleepy smile as he snuggled deeper into the jacket. "You're full of surprises, Lee," he murmured before his eyes drifted shut again. Sebastian stared at him for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his expression before he returned to his work. When the clock struck 10, the library's automated system locked the doors, sealing them inside. Ethan woke to the sound of a faint mechanical click, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice still groggy. Sebastian glanced at the nearest exit, his brow furrowing. "The doors are locked. We're stuck." Ethan groaned, burying his face in his hands. "Great. Just what I needed, being trapped with you all night." Sebastian's lips quirked into a smirk. "The feeling's mutual, Ward." They wandered the library together, searching for a way out. The silence between them was less hostile now, replaced by a tentative truce as they navigated the dimly lit aisles. Ethan's stomach growled, breaking the quiet. He shot Sebastian an embarrassed look. "Don't suppose you have a stash of snacks in that fancy bag of yours?" Sebastian shook his head, suppressing a chuckle. "You should have planned ahead, Ward." Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't help the small smile tugging at his lips. "You're impossible." Eventually they gave up on finding an escape and returned to their corner of the library. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by piles of books, the atmosphere felt surprisingly relaxed. Ethan leaned his head against the bookshelf, staring at the ceiling. "You're not as bad as I thought. Sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian glanced at him, his expression softening again. "Don't get used to it," he replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. They sat in silence after that, the air between them no longer charged with animosity, but something far more complicated. Neither of them said it aloud, but both felt the subtle shift in their dynamic, a crack in the wall of rivalry that had always defined them. Ethan adjusted his glasses and stared intently at his laptop screen, the equations blurring together into an incomprehensible mess. He let out a groan, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Across the cafe table, Sebastian took a sip of his espresso, barely hiding the amused smirk tugging at his lips. "You're going to burn a hole through the screen if you keep glaring at it like that." Ethan glared at him instead. "I'm fine, Lee. Not everyone has a supercomputer for a brain." Sebastian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Clearly. What part are you stuck on?" Ethan hesitated, his pride warring with his frustration. Finally, he sighed and gestured at his screen. "This formula? I can't figure out how to make it apply to our data set." Sebastian leaned forward, and suddenly he was much closer than Ethan expected. His arm brushed against Ethan's as he pointed to the equation on the screen. "You're using the wrong variable here," Sebastian said, his voice low and steady. "It should be based on the standard deviation, not the mean." Ethan's brain should have been focusing on the words, but all he could think about was how close Sebastian was. He could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from him. His heart skipped a beat, and he leaned back slightly, trying to put some distance between them. Right. That makes sense," Ethan said, his voice higher than he'd intended. Sebastian noticed and tilted his head, an infuriatingly smug grin spreading across his face. "Something wrong, Ward? You look flustered." Ethan scowled, his cheeks heating. "I'm not flustered. I just didn't expect you to get in my personal space. That's all." Sebastian chuckled, leaning back into his chair, recklessly stubborn and easily embarrassed. A fascinating combination. "Excuse me?" Ethan snapped, his earlier fluster forgotten as indignation took over. "I'm not stubborn. I'm determined. There's a difference." "Sure there is," Sebastian said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Their banter continued, but there was a new undercurrent to it. Something lighter, almost playful. An hour later, the cafe had emptied out significantly, leaving only a handful of students hunched over their books and laptops. Their work session had mellowed into a more comfortable rhythm, punctuated by the occasional teasing remark. As Ethan reached for his coffee, he glanced at Sebastian and asked, "Do you ever get tired of being perfect at everything?" Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't call it perfect. More like adequately prepared." Ethan snorted. "Right. Adequately prepared with straight A's, a spotless student council record, and an internship at one of the top firms in the city. Must be exhausting." Sebastian's smirk faltered slightly, and Ethan immediately regretted his sarcasm. "It's not as glamorous as it sounds," Sebastian said quietly. He toyed with the edge of his coffee cup, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "When your family has high expectations, it doesn't leave much room for failure, or for being anything less than perfect." The vulnerability in Sebastian's voice caught Ethan off guard. For the first time, he saw a crack in the polished armor Sebastian always wore. "I get that," Ethan said after a pause. "My brother is a straight-A med student, captain of his university's rugby team, and basically the golden child. No matter what I do, I'm always just the other Ward." Sebastian looked at him, his expression softening. "You don't seem like the kind of person who lets anyone else define him." Ethan smiled faintly. "I try not to, but sometimes it's hard not to feel like I'm constantly trying to prove myself." They fell into a rare, companionable silence, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as they sat in their shared moment of honesty. As they packed up to leave, the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the cafe. By the time they stepped outside, the skies had opened up, releasing a torrential downpour. "Perfect," Ethan muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. Sebastian pulled a sleek black umbrella from his bag and opened it with a practiced flick of his wrist. Without a word, he stepped closer, holding it over both of them. Ethan hesitated, feeling uncomfortably aware of how close they would have to be. but with the rain already soaking his shoes, he reluctantly moved under the umbrella. "Thanks," he mumbled, trying to keep as much distance as possible without stepping into the rain. Sebastian gave him a sidelong glance, his expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. You're walking ridiculously slow." "Maybe because I'm trying not to slip and break my neck," Ethan shot back. Sebastian shook his head with a small laugh. "Hold this." He handed Ethan the umbrella, then casually placed a hand on his elbow, guiding him more steadily along the slippery sidewalk. Ethan's heart raced at the unexpected touch, and he felt his cheeks heat. He glanced up at Sebastian, who was completely unfazed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Ethan's nervous energy. "You're oddly good at this," Ethan said, his voice quieter than usual. "At what?" "Being kind," Ethan admitted, feeling strangely vulnerable. Sebastian smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Don't get used to it." By the time they reached campus, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. They stood under the awning of a dormitory building, waiting for the last of the storm to pass. Ethan glanced at Sebastian out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way the faint glow of the streetlights softened his usually sharp features. He quickly looked away, confused by the fluttering in his chest. "Well," Ethan said, clearing his throat, "I guess I'll see you tomorrow." Sebastian nodded, his expression unreadable again. "Don't be late. I hate waiting." Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't help the small smile tugging at his lips. As he turned to leave, he caught himself glancing back over his shoulder, only to find Sebastian watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. For the first time, Ethan wondered if there was more to their rivalry than just competition. And for the first time, the thought didn't entirely terrify him.